Okay, so my presentation is mainly trying to frame the linkages between public debt and tax justice. Because we are talking about public mobilization. I think how my presentation is set is just to kind of put out the issues, how they relate with each other, that is public debt and tax justice, and then maybe speak to how we can move forward in this conversation, or how we can move forward as a movement. Now, my presentation is based on a recently launched publication called The Economic Sustainability in East Africa. And we worked on this publication together with the Africa Center for People, Institutions, and Society. As they are called ACEPIS, they are based in Nairobi, and they are an Afrocentric think tank, and they are dealing in informing public dialogue, policy, and inclusiveness in sustainable development. So I believe I have 10 minutes, and so I'd like to just quickly go through the slides and then allow for some space for reactions or questions. And so just to take you through, the purpose of the study was to understand the implications of public debt in East Africa in relation to the tax burden that will affect East African citizens, the questions of illicit financial flows and harmful tax practices and how they will manifest in the region. How does the question of public debt relate to issues of economic growth and resource distribution? And lastly, what does it mean in terms of empowerment and inclusion of citizen voices in public finance management, fiscal policy making? Now, if you think of economic justice, you have to think of the revenue cycles and then what that means in terms of public debt and taxation. When I speak about revenue cycles, you have to realize that tax has to be collected, then allocated, and then spent. You will then audit it. And so there is a chain of what happens to revenue year in, year out. But then if you look at the context of our economies, we have to look for means in which we finance these budgets or these revenue cycles. So from collection to expenditure, and how it affects in terms of service delivery and so forth. We have to think about where does the money come from. Of course, there's taxation, where you'll go out and collect money. But if that is not possible, then you have to think of where else to get, hence the issue of debt. So debt is one of the means by which you finance development. But then the question that we raise and why it becomes a question of economic justice is based on how you're doing or how you're going through the cycle. There are instances in which you find yourselves in a situation of tax injustice, where there is unfairness in the system, whether it is at the collection, expenditure, allocation, or even just general management. And these instances of tax injustice normally manifest by affecting service delivery for most citizens in the region. Now, in that case then, when we specifically look at the question of debt and taxation, then you see there are general concerns over the looming debt crisis in sub-Saharan Africa. This is because 40% of countries are in or at a high risk of debt distress. When we look at the region of our mandate in East Africa, the debt has grown very rapidly from 2010 to 2018. These figures, especially in terms of the recent coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic, definitely will be updated. But you can see there is a steady rise in a debt crisis in the region and across sub-Saharan Africa. In terms of the debt to GDP ratio, Kenya has 59.3%, Uganda 40%, Tanzania 36.7%, Rwanda 41%, Burundi 12%. Now, these are 2018 figures, but clearly with the challenges that you have, there is going to be a steady rise in this issue. Nonetheless, what we note is that increased debt has not translated into improved economic growth. So just because you're accumulating debt, and particularly in terms of how it is normally justified, has not translated in economic growth, directly linked to people's lives and so forth. And so you hear a lot of the conversation about how, what is this debt for? And how is it that it's not affecting people's lives and so forth? But then nonetheless, what has increased is the debt servicing cost. So if you think about the money that goes into paying the debt, this has increased significantly over that period. If you look at that table, if you take the case of Rwanda, from 2014-2015, it has jumped from 4.2% to 35% in 2018-2019. Some are steady. So if you take Kenya, for instance, it plays around 9 to 6 and 7%. Then come 2017, 2018, there's now a steady rise and so forth. So you can see we are paying out more money to make sure that we are servicing our debts, but there is definitely going to be an impact in terms of our service delivery within individual nations. What then is resulting is that governments are failing to raise sufficient revenue despite overall increases in tax revenue. So in as much as they are looking for means to increase the revenue, they don't have enough to cater for their needs. And this has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Day in, day out, if you read the newspapers in East Africa and probably around the world, countries are looking to find additional means of taxation to bridge these revenue gaps. And this is presenting a serious challenge to the tax systems in each of these countries, because the burden is increasingly being shifted to majority of poor citizens. And when this is happening, they are not feeling the growth. So there is some form of disconnect when you think about the effect of debt servicing and debt in general in relation to the lives and economic situation of citizens. So when we think about the linkages of public debt and taxation, we first have to think about the question of fairness in taxation. Now, the first thing that you see is that rising public debt has resulted in imposition of new taxes on citizens. So an increased tax burden for sure. In that case, then, if you look at mostly the taxes being proposed, these are mainly indirect taxes which affect mostly poor people. Then secondly, you can say that tax policy in the region does not benefit citizens. If you think about the idea of human rights in terms of the principles of participation, accountability, non-discrimination, empowerment, and following the rule of law, a lot of the citizens are being marginalized out of this. And so there is no great benefit to the citizens. And therefore, when they look at the debt repayment strategy, they feel that there is a systemic unfairness in the prioritization of other institutions, other structures in place, or people that money is being transferred to, as opposed to catering for the needs of citizens. Secondly, in terms of the linkage, you have to think of illicit financial flows and harmful tax practices. Now, in illicit financial flows, there's the legal means by which money leaves a country without going through coffers of government if it was thought that these are potential areas for taxation, or the illegal means. What is happening is that illicit financial flows are increasingly outweighing overseas development assistance. Money going out isn't as much as money coming in, and that is impeding economic development and sustainability at averages of 6.1% of sub-Saharan Africa's GDP. If you think in East Africa, Kenya loses the most with an annual figure of 40 billion. With IFFs and harmful tax practices, which include crime, smuggling, and so forth, what happens to government is that they find themselves in a situation of shrinking revenue base And then with revenue losses, then you have budget strain, because now government doesn't have the means to cater to the needs that it needs to be addressing thanks to the social contract. Thirdly, when you think of economic growth and resource distribution in East Africa, there is no nonlinear relationship between the amount of debt a country has and the economic growth. So we find ourselves in a situation of growing account deficits, rising external debt, and this immediately shows a level of disconnect between what people expect economic growth to be while what is actually happening. The spending then goes increasingly to pay debts. Spending within countries and in provision of service delivery becomes very limited and inefficient, and therefore the citizens don't gain in terms of public goods and services, which are their rights. So we then get ourselves in a debt trap where borrowing then becomes the main source or one of the key sources of budget financing. And so you borrow to pay Peter, you borrow Paul to pay Peter, and this then becomes a never-ending cycle. Lastly, because of this strained situation, you find that in terms of empowerment and the inclusion of citizen voices, there is increasingly very poor public participation in management of fiscal policy. It's not only a question of poor public participation, but it seems, and sometimes when you investigate a bit more, they are deliberately weak frameworks that are in place to keep the government accountable. And then there's limited information on what debt has been accumulated and how it's being spent on. Lastly, you find that parliaments then become weak or are in a situation of weakness in that whole policy process, in that they can't hold the government to account and ask it about what exactly is this money being spent on, how is it being acquired, how can it benefit the systems better, and so forth. And so this then becomes a challenging process in terms of empowerment and having a say in what money is used for. Overall, the relationships between public debt and economic development, tax fairness, inequality are nonlinear, in that there are lots of disconnects in this. So there is need for further studies to demonstrate the strength of these linkages. And once those studies come out, they would help inform people in terms of how to act in getting tax justice, in getting economic justice through the revenue cycles, whether you have public debt or not. And so in that regard, other than the study we have done in relation to economic sustainability in East Africa, we have also done another study that speaks to the revenue obligations and civics in East Africa, where we speak mainly about human rights-based approach to tax justice. Here, we champion and say we should really look at tax justice as a question of participation, accountability, non-discrimination, empowerment, and the rule of law, in making sure that there is economic justice in the revenue cycles of public finance management. With this approach, we think that it is important, and this is something not only youths, but even women groups and people with disabilities and so forth, various interest groups that have a stake in revenue cycles have to use in order to champion their case. So with a human rights-based approach, in terms of programming and in terms of advocacy, we have to look at causality in terms of what are the causes of tax injustice, how do they manifest, are they close or are they far, and so forth. Secondly, we have to look at the patterns. We have to determine what kind of relationships do the people in power and the citizens have, and how do these play out in terms of implementation of revenue cycles and achievement of service delivery. Thirdly, we have to look at capacity gaps. Where are the challenges in terms of who has the responsibility, who has the authority, where are the resources located, how are the decisions being made, and how are these decisions being communicated? If there are problems in those processes, how can we address them? Fourth, we then have to determine priorities. On this, it's in terms of getting the right solutions, we have to determine importance, feasibility, and urgency. And then lastly, coming mainly to the question of implementing tax justice, always asking ourselves, how are we mobilizing and with whom? How are we communicating that we want tax justice in whatever process? How are we training people and informing them and making them more aware? And how are we improving the systems and infrastructure available to help us achieve economic justice? Once we do this, then I could say that particularly if you think of the question of youth, when they put these ideas in their actions, then we will be moving a step closer to getting economic justice, tax justice, and tackling the debt problem in East Africa and Africa. So with that also, I'll welcome you to check out some of our publications on the website of the East Africa Tax and Governance Network. And I'd like to stop my presentation there, welcoming questions or just following guidance from our moderator. Thank you so much.
To read and sign the Harare Declaration, go to www.afrodat.org/initiatives. Click on Afrodat Conference on Data and Development, and then read more. And finally, the outcome statement.